walk around the island. Good evening.
Joining us for dinner?
Oh, no, we're just looking around now.
All right.
We'll be here for dinner tomorrow.
Godspeed your love to me. But now that the stars are in your eyes, I'm beginning to see the light. See we're rolling, rolling, rolling on a river.
Yesterday we walked around the island 8 miles, and now we're on the bike. We're going to do the same drive, but this time we're on the bike. Took 4 hours to walk it. We stopped a bunch of times. Made nice to a horse. And here she is. Look at how she's riding this thing. How you doing? What do you think?
Oh, just peachy keen.
Peachy keen? Let me get on the other side of you. I'll be on this side for the moment. Boy, I don't want to drop this phone. It's too new. I'm going to stop in a moment. Okay. Okay, we're going to stop by this sign here. Let's stop over here, honey. You're doing so well, babe. What do you have to say for yourself, babe?
Oh, it's very nice. Well, I believe it, very nice.
Not too many hills here at this point?
No, it's nice. It's flat. That's what I like it.
So this is actually called a program, not a walking tour, because we're not really walking that much. We're essentially just slowly backpedaling to a really nice view. So feel free to follow along. So my name is Josiah. I'm one of the military interpreters here at Fort Mackinac, and this is going to be the Medicine at Fort Mackinac program. And so we're actually going to start at the foundation of this fort, which was during the American Revolution. So the American Revolution is declared, and Michilimackinac from the mainland is moved to Fort Mackinac on the island. And that's the foundation of this fort and the town down below us. And this story is going to connect the town and the fort quite considerably, because most Army medicine during this time period, which is most of Army history, we're talking from the foundation of the nation until the creation of the hospital corps in the 1870s. Those are going to be doctors which are serving at forts, mostly to build their reputation by also working in towns. So most doctors, starting in the time of the American Revolution up through the Civil War, are earning most of their actual education, not from a formal education in a college setting. There would have actually only been 3 medical colleges in America during the Revolution. They're going to be learning what they need to know under an apprenticeship of some kind. And so these apprenticeships, when they finish and conclude that work with whatever doctor they're studying under, they don't necessarily have a clientele immediately. If you were to go to Boston in 1820, you would have found that the town was already serviced by doctors, and everyone knew what doctor they were going to, and there wasn't a whole lot of open room for new physicians to enter the market, especially not those which had been raised and taught under an apprenticeship, which would have not been as flashy as some of those doctors which could have traveled to England to study at an English medical college. So these men who are trying to get into this field find the Army as a very easy way to build up their reputation. They enlist, and they immediately have a garrison that they can care for. The only issue is that normally there wouldn't be very much medical support for these men. You're looking at maybe 1 surgeon plus an assistant surgeon, and if you're lucky, 1 steward, a couple stewards, to serve maybe 80 to 100 men, like at Fort Mackinac. For the majority of this fort's history, there would have been 1 or 2 men serving the medical needs of over 80 to 100 men in the garrison. And that's just not a lot of support. Anywhere that you have men involved in serious combat, you are going to need someone who knows how the human body works and how to care for it. And so, since the advent of warfare, there's always been some type of doctor involved in that frontline combat. A big reason that the hospital corps eventually was created is because it was much better to have men who were permanently on duty of moving men off of the firing line when they were injured, rather than relying on the men of the firing line to remove their fallen comrades. If one man gets shot and an army of hospital stewards can come and remove him from the line, that means 1 man is taken off the firing line. But if you don't have that army of support in the medical corps, what you're going to see is that 1 man getting shot ends up taking 3 or 4 men off of your firing line, which is just not preferable. And so a lot of that type of understanding that the combat effectiveness of your fort could be heavily augmented favorably by the addition of a hospital corps was discovered during the Civil War. During the Civil War, you see a lot of essentially what would be cottage industry taking effect to provide for the military. And you also see large charity organizations and volunteer corps forming up to help during that conflict. And so what you see is these Army surgeons who are used to not having the greatest support, all of a sudden that have this amazing civilian outpouring to get volunteer nurses, volunteer ambulance drivers, and hospital stewards. Now, at the end of that war, you see the Army considerably shrunk down from over 1 million men in the service during that conflict to just about 25,000 coming out of that conflict. And so that greatly reduced Army also receives almost no funding. There was a general understanding in American history coming before the Second World War that we were a majority isolationist country and did not require a large standing military. Coming out of the Civil War, you're looking at the American population being about 65 million people, more people than living in France, but yet France's army is 20 times the size. And so the issue that was present before the Civil War is actually compounded after the Civil War, with many of the doctors forced to not only go and practice on the civilian population for the sake of building a reputation in a new urban center, but also working in urban centers to finance themselves through a private practice. And so, at the end of that conflict, at the end of the Civil War, it takes about a decade or so for the creation of the hospital corps to come around. That would come around in 1887. So actually that would be, 7 years, 17 years. You're looking at 23 years for the creation of the hospital corps to come and solve these problems. So the hospital corps set around giving support for these assistant surgeons through the creation of a regular access to ambulance services and hospital stewards, as well as matrons, hospital matrons, which would have been stationed here at Fort Mackinac. I'm wondering if we can see it. I was hoping we'd be able to. This tour is pretty new. We can't. Okay, we might make our way farther into the parade ground here in a minute to look at two buildings. But before we do that, I just want to talk about the town. And in particular, I want to talk about the building that is down on the corner of the street there. So you see the church. Feel free to come up as close as you want to the walls. You see the church there, that's Trinity Episcopal Church. That would be put up by the Fort soldiers here in the 1860s. And then there's a building next to that, and then there's a building next to that. Now that third building, which is a little covered by these trees, that would actually be the American Fur Trading Company and Retail Store. So the prominence here in medical history, especially for the military, is the work of Dr. William Beaumont. So we're actually going back in history a little bit. I skimmed over him at the beginning. Dr. William Beaumont would have been serving here in the 1820s. Now that was the time when a lot of these doctors are getting these apprenticeships, and then they're coming to forts to further their medical career through joining the military. And so him serving at Fort Mackinac, he would have also been serving the town heavily, because he would have been the only doctor on the island. The story is that a French-Canadian voyageur, so essentially a trucker who would bring big canoefuls of goods up and down the Great Lakes, was stopping in at Mackinac Island to get provisioned at that general store. And while he was down there, he was shot. We don't know exactly how. He was shot through the stomach, is what we know. And Dr. William Beaumont would be the man who goes down to save his life. Now that would win him some serious fame and accreditation, and so that's a good tie-in to the fact that these men are joining the Army, hopefully to build their reputation as doctors. This is a great chance for him, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. This is a great chance for him to build his reputation as a doctor. He goes down and actually wins fame not just for himself, but for American medicine, which is the slogan that's on a little rock dedicated to him down at the fort. What that Alexis St. Martin had was known as a gastrofistula. So, gastro for the stomach, fistula, just a hole into the stomach. That was a term that was taught to me by a nurse last season. So, a gastrofistula was allowing him to finally study the inner workings of a man's digestive tract. For the first time in modern medical history, we understood that digestion was not a muscular process, that it was a chemical process, and just exactly how that chemical process worked, and through that, better ways to treat intestinal issues, both disease-related and just trauma-related, like his issue with that bullet wound to the stomach. And so that, for him, was essentially what he was looking for. He came here to get paid to work at the fort, and then he was able to go save a man's life downtown and rocket himself to national fame. There are Beaumont hospitals both in the southwestern section of the country over near El Paso, as well as here in Michigan in Detroit, the Beaumont Hospital Network. So that is Dr. William Beaumont. So a very a success story, you would say, for a medical officer in the early period of the United States Army. But that hospital corps I talked about, the creation of the hospital corps, which is what we're kind of culminating to in this tour. And to show you that, we're going to walk back so you can actually see the new steward's quarters in the hospital that would have gone up in the 1860s and in the 1880s to kind of work with this hospital corps. So, we're going to keep walking. We're also going to talk briefly about Wounded Knee, but I don't have my outline, so we're hoping this works. So you can see it just above the commissary there. That would be the post hospital, constructed 1860. Now, that wouldn't see much service directly after its construction date, because you're looking at the beginning of the American Civil War, and seeing as we're way up on the northern Great Lakes, we're not seeing much action during the American Civil War. But the hospital would come in handy once the creation of the hospital corps came around, and they decided to construct a steward's quarters just next door. So they're actually housing these men now as professional stewards who are living on base to do work in that hospital. And that's all starting with this hospital corps. Now, the hospital corps really was tested during the events at Wounded Knee. Wounded Knee was essentially the end of the Plains Wars. It was the last large engagement that took place between U.S. Armed Forces and a native group. Now, during that conflict, very early on, within the onset of the engagement, the highest ranking officer within the hospital corps serving at that battle would have been killed very, very early on. And so it really tested the resolve of all of the new men that were underneath him to do their job correctly, and they did it very well. You see actually very few fatalities from that event from men who would have otherwise possibly died because they were brought quickly off the line by a professional group and then cared for quickly and immediately. And so that's the tour. I think we're going to call it there. Thank you very much for coming. We've been able to go over the hospital corps' creation, when they were really tested, what buildings were serving them at Fort Mackinac, and most importantly, the life and testament of Dr. William Beaumont as a very successful Army surgeon before the creation of the hospital corps, to show you kind of the motivations of the men who were joining the Army. And so thank you very much for coming. If you have any questions, this is just going to move into questions. What's your question?
I understand about the doctors and their training, but how did they have enough supplies? Who provided the supplies for the doctors to use for the soldiers?
That would have been provided by the United States military as well as by private purchase. Some of the time these doctors would have been growing their own supplies if they were using something more herbal based, and they also would have been running that private practice in whatever town they were stationed at that was giving them a private income that then they could use to purchase equipment. Now, I don't know particularly how much of that private purchase equipment is being used on soldiers and how much of the equipment given by the military is being used on the civilian population, but there were essentially two sides to that coin always taking place on military bases, where there is support and pay coming from the Army to do Army duties, and support and pay coming from the civilian population to run that private practice. Yes. That's fun. We have one guy who works here named Christian Guillory who is working pretty hard to try to memorize all of those calls because he's the company musician when he finally shows up. Fun guy, real fun guy. We're waiting for him.
Am I correct in remembering that doctor put food on a string and put it in the stomach and then like let it?
Yes, it was those types of experiments.
Yeah.
Yes. Just anything to do with that little wound that he could possibly figure out how to conduct an experiment on. He wanted to know. It was actually a bit of an unequal relationship between him and his patient, that French-Canadian voyageur and a respected military doctor. And there was also a bit of a debt there for saving his life. And so they would actually live and work together for the foreseeable future, up until the later years of Alexis St. Martin's life. Just traveling the country and performing these experiments live for different medical boards. So essentially proving the theories over and over again. He was required for that work to continue. And so he was really roped into that by Dr. William Beaumont. Eventually he would be let go back into his regular life. And he would eventually live to also have a family. But just something else to know about Alexis St. Martin. He got the rough end of that stick. His life was really changed when he got shot in his stomach, and Dr. William Beaumont descended on him to earn his fame. Yeah.
How did they like plug it up or something? How would you walk around with a hole into your stomach?
It would grow over eventually. It wasn't just this open wound for the rest of his life, but it was a difficult circumstance, and a circumstance you were most likely going to die from, but he just didn't.
Wow. Good for him.
Yeah. It's almost a little bit of like a myth at this point when you talk about it with people, because it is interesting to remember that he was a real guy. You know, like that's just a strange thing to happen. Yeah. It was roughly the size of a golf ball. That was the gastrofistula.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty big. A little flap.
Well, let's go over the name of the cannon. The Model 1841 6-pound smoothbore field gun. So, Model 1841, that's the year this cannon would have been designed and adopted. That's taking place just about during the beginning of the Mexican-American War. So that was a war that was fought down south, kind of on the border of modern-day Texas. It's what won us most of the modern territorial holdings in the southwestern section of the country. So Nevada, Arizona, New Mexico, those types of stations. Model 1841 6-pound, that's just the size of the cannonball, a good 6-pound cannonball. Smooth bore. This is a smooth bore cannon, so the inside of this cannon is just as smooth as the outside, and so that means that it's essentially just a big explosion with a cannonball that almost rattles out of the cannon. That can really hurt its accuracy. Now, like I said, this cannon saw most of its service during the Mexican-American War, but that's most of its service. During the American Civil War, these cannons would see new life, mostly employed by the southern states. The southern states had less access to the industrial capacity that the North had access to, and they regularly brought up older cannons to supplement their artillery, and this would have been one of the primary cannons being purchased by the Confederate States during that conflict. A couple of the cannons would then be further adjusted and augmented to see better military service. A lot of them would become rifled, but the issue was putting rifling in after the fact. One, it's not going to be as good as rifling that's tooled straight from the factory, and two, it's going to wear out faster. And so you have a lot of these cannons getting that new rifling and then quickly becoming kind of a smoothbore again as that rifling gets degraded. The last part of that name would be the Model 1841 6-pound smoothbore field gun. So these big wheels really doesn't make sense up here on the walls of Fort Mackinac. The reason being, like I said, this was a very desirable station, and these men were serving as the headquarters of a national park. And so they get this old gun. It doesn't matter that it's a field gun. It just sits up here on the walls, and it's just a cool-looking historic gun. Like I said, though, this one in particular would be a reproduction. All of our original guns were taken just during the Second World War, and they were melted down for scrap. So you're going to find little pieces of the cannons of Fort Mackinac all over the battlefields in France.
Well, today it's a buffet, if you wish. Got a couple of groups here from Georgia and other places. What do you think of this one?
Good. Go get your plate.
Okay.